Good evening. Welcome to everyone in the audience and to those watching via the HCAM feed. We're going to go ahead and get started on time at 6:30 for those who are here, and hopefully others will roll in, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time who is here at 6:30, both, as I said, on here and on the HCAM feed. Wanted to start first by introducing the members of our panel. My name is John Graziano. I am chair of the Elementary School Building Committee tasked with working on the solution for the Elmwood School.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tiffany Ostrander. I am the vice chair of the Elmwood School Building Committee and a parent of a kindergartner and 2 children who are not school age quite yet.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Kavanaugh, superintendent of schools.
Good evening, Susan Rothermick, Director of Finance and Operations.
Hi, everyone. Tim Person, Director of Facilities.
And over at the other table, which we created this divide between the community staff and the professional staff, not on purpose, but Dan, if you want to start.
Sure. Good evening. I'm Dan Colley. I'm from Perkins Eastman. We're the architect.
And I'm Dan Ahrens, also with Perkins Eastman.
I'm Heather Howergy, also with Perkins Eastman, Director of Sustainability.
I'm Christopher Eberly with Compass Project Management. We're the OPM on the project for the town.
I'm Jeff D'Amico, the project executive with Compass Vertex.
Before we jump into the agenda, for those audience members, you'll notice that we put up here the guest Wi-Fi login for here in the auditorium. Later in the presentation, we're going to be using some online tools to kind of gather some information and opinions from those participating in the forum, both here and on the HCAM feed. So we want to make sure that you can log in. So if you could, I know reception on phones is spotty in this area. So if you could go ahead and try to get whatever device you have logged into the Wi-Fi, that will make it easier to gather feedback once we get to that point in the presentation. So I want to quickly go over the agenda tonight. So if we could go to the next slide. So our forum agenda is, we've already started with the welcome and introductions. We're going to do a short recap of our previous community forum, which was our project community kickoff meeting. We'll talk about the initial assessment of the Elmwood building and site that has been done so far, as well as exploration of potential alternative sites within town and how we're evaluating those sites, what criteria that the committee is using, and seek some feedback from the audience on that. We'll then speak about the overall sustainability concepts and net zero energy possibilities for a new building. And then we will have a Q&A portion for anyone who is either in the auditorium or on the HCAM broadcast. They'll be displaying the email address for the ESBC, so you can send in your questions and we will try to answer them live during the Q&A portion. About a month ago, we kicked off the community engagement portion of this project. And we reviewed a couple of key points. The first one was why Elmwood and why now? The short version of that is that Elmwood is facing significant space constraints, and the facility is not able to deliver the kind of 21st century education that we want to have for our children in 2nd and 3rd grade building. Mrs. Carver and the faculty and staff over there are doing a fabulous job with what they have, but a new or upgraded building would provide even more opportunity for them to deliver that great education. In 2020, we were invited into the process with the Mass School Building Authority to look at a replacement or renovation of the Elmwood School. And so that's why we began the process when we did. We're in our second community forum. The purpose of these forums is that we want to gather as much feedback from the community and provide as much information as we can about the process so that we are sure that whatever solution is brought before town meeting, it not only has been thoroughly vetted and communicated with the community, but that you've had the opportunity to weigh in and really provide what are the priorities of the community, because ultimately this solution is going to need to be one that will be supported by the entire community of Hopkinton. We'll go into the project process and timeline a little bit, but I did just want to hit on the last point here, which is we introduced the idea of educational visioning and planning. In the next few weeks, we'll be commissioning yet another group of community members to help us with the educational visioning and planning for the new school, either the expanded Elmwood school or a replacement school. The purpose of this is to gather feedback from the community on what should be some of the priorities and the vision for the educational model that will be delivered at the new school. We sought volunteers and we got a number of really great applicants. We think it's going to be a wonderful cross-section of professional backgrounds, of some parents of younger children, some parents of older children, some community members who don't have any children in the school system, so that we can get the real community view of what this school should be that we're going to ultimately bring before town meeting. In terms of the project process and timeline, up until this point, the biggest accomplishments that we have had as a school building committee are to hire on the professionals that are going to help us through this process. So Compass Project Management, our owner's project manager, and Perkins Eastman, our architecture firm, have both introduced themselves to you here. They were selected through a pretty rigorous RFP process in partnership with the MSBA, and we're really excited about what they bring to the process. Some of you might be aware, Compass Project Management was actually the owner's project manager on the last building project that resulted in the Marathon School. So they have some real strong knowledge, not just of the process, but also of the Hopkinton community and what in particular we're looking for. So it's been, despite the fact that we sat this far away from them, it's been great to work with these professionals, and we're really looking forward to it. At this point, I'm actually going to hand it over to Jeff D'Amico from Compass, who's going to talk a little bit about the timeline as we go forward.
Thanks, John. So overall timeline, the MSBA process takes about 5 years from the time you're invited into the feasibility study to the time you open your building. And then there's, of course, the closeout and commissioning phases that happen thereafter. You're about halfway through the first year of that process, which is forming the team. As John alluded to, you hired both your owner's project manager and your designer. And so the next 6 months are the most critical in terms of decision making for the building committee and the town at large. That's where we vet through the options to determine the size of the building, location of the building, what it essentially looks like, and that will roll into a decision that gets recommended by the building committee to then go back in front of the MSBA for ratification and moving forward to the schematic design phase. Schematic design essentially makes up about 30% of the overall design of the building, and that would take us through the summer of 2023, at which point you would know the total cost and size of the project. That would go back in front of the Mass School Building Authority for their approval, and then back to the taxpayers for the funding vote, both at a town meeting and at a special town meeting and a ballot. The MSBA submission, as you see on the screen here, comes with 3 major milestones. The first one is the preliminary design program, and so that's the next few months that we're in now, where we look at the educational program, we assess the existing buildings, some of which you'll hear about tonight, and we look at available sites in town. That'll take us through to December. At that point, we'll transition over to the preferred schematic stage, which is where we look in depth at a short list of options, ultimately looking at the 2 grade configurations that are out there, both the 2-3 and the 2-4 grades, and determine what those look like on the various sites that are available. The building committee will make a recommendation in February, and then go back to the school committee and selectmen for their recommendations as well, and then get submitted to the MSBA back in March. So that's the critical next 6 months time frame. And then lastly, that schematic design takes you to 30% of the way from March down to the end of the summer, where you finalize the costs. I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about where we are now, which is the existing conditions assessment, and I can answer questions on this later on.
Thanks, Jeff. I know many of you are familiar with the Elmwood School. It was originally constructed in 1965 to house grades 4 through 6. Since then, it has undergone additions and renovations, most notably in 1989. It's also had modulars added in 2004 and 2020 to address overcrowding, but it also has had its roof and boilers replaced and some restroom upgrades and playground upgrades over the past 55 years of its lifetime. The building itself is set on about a 19-acre site that's accessed off of Elm Street. Tennessee gas line separates the 2 baseball fields from the building. Both the parking and the play areas are insufficient to support the current enrollment. There are wetlands and a significant grade drop-off at the northwest, which will prohibit development on that portion of the site. From a code perspective, all the exits that are not connected to the public way, and the asphalt and concrete surfaces have reached the end of their useful life and would need to be replaced at this point. This diagram shows a test fit for the Elmwood Street site. The existing building is shown in red here. The new building element here represents the program. That rectangle is the public space. It's the cafeteria, gym, media center, administrative spaces, and adjacent to those are the classroom wings. This is not a design, it's a representation that meets the programmatic requirements from a daylighting orientation and scale perspective. We have avoided the northwestern part of the site and the gas line, and what this is showing us is how tight this site will become when we layer in the constraints in the program. It also shows from a phasing standpoint that this may prove to be a challenging site that will have a significant impact on the delivery of the educational program during the construction process. To develop the repair scope, we had over 10 different engineering and design trades visit the building over several weeks in the beginning of the school year. From those visits, we created a number of narratives, reports, and drawings. This is an example of the architectural scoping drawing where we laid out space by space the deficiencies and the work required to bring the building up to code and replace outdated systems. This is what's referred to as a code or a base repair option, and it's a requirement of the feasibility study process. It is basically all the work required to bring the building up to code without addressing any program deficiency. The program deficiencies are shown here, and they're separate from the code repair. This drawing shows program issues present in the current facility in a number of undersized spaces: the music room, art room, cafeteria, special education, administrative support spaces. Classrooms are the right size. However, that big red square there, it says 34,000 square feet, represents the shortfall in the educational program space for the projected enrollment. It's notable also that the distances from some of the classrooms from the staff to the staff bathrooms are significant. On the first floor, from the modulars to the bathroom is about 500 feet or a 1,000-foot round trip. And on the second floor, from the modular to the bathroom is a 300-foot or a 600-foot round trip. In Massachusetts, the code requires us to bring the building up to full accessibility if any project we undertake is more than 30% of the assessed value of the building. In this case, a project of $1.7 million or more would trigger full compliance. This building has many of the more common access issues found in buildings of this era: restrooms, exits, entrance access, and maneuvering clearances. Unique here is the number of different elevations that are present in the building. If you go in the main entrance right now, we call that 0. As we move northwards towards the music room, there's a drop of 2 feet. If we go over to the gym, which is very close by, it drops another foot to 3 feet. From the entrance, if we go the other direction, up towards the media center, you go up 2 feet, and then another foot up into the southern classroom wing. That's very unusual for such a small footprint to have so many ramps. And those ramps and stairs that are there are currently not code compliant. From a building code standpoint, the facility exhibits many deficiencies that are common to the era as well. There are 3 items that are notable. The first one is the size of the building. It's non-conforming in area, meaning square footage, and that means any additions would need to be fully separated by a firewall. The building is primarily constructed of non-reinforced masonry, which in and of itself is not an issue, but if we renovate more than 50% of the interior space, we would need to bring the building up to full structural code. Finally, like many buildings during this period, the floor-to-floor clearances are very tight. 9'1" at the first floor and 8'8" at the second floor, and that's the level from the floor to the structure above. This will create significant spatial challenges for the installation of new code compliant mechanical systems. So move into site selection. One of the requirements of a feasibility study is to leave no stone unturned when it comes to site selection. To that end, our team, we zoomed back out and looked at the entire community, searching for any site that was 10 acres or more that we felt could potentially support a school. We put aside ownership at this level, and we just looked to create a list of potential parcels. This map and chart show the properties highlighted. The 3 highlighted are the town-owned properties, and the schools are also highlighted, and it shows the rest of the ones that we found. In order to reduce that number under consideration, we developed a preliminary screening criteria. We were able to further narrow down the potential sites. Many were removed due to environmental concerns: wetlands, rivers, streams, ponds, and the like. and we also removed some because they were inaccessible or difficult to access from a suitable public way. Several were also removed due to the presence of significant utility infrastructure or right-of-ways. The remainder were screened using the other criteria in order to arrive at a smaller list. And on the right side is a number of diagrams that we will be using throughout the process to graphically represent some of the information as we move forward.
So over the next few months, there's a lot of data that will be generated by the project team to provide it to the building committee for their analysis. In order to help them with their analysis, we've developed a matrix here that was utilized similarly on the Marathon School, where we list the number of options across the top. As I noted, there's 2 grade configurations, and as Dan just talked about, there's multiple sites available in town, both the existing Elmwood site as well as some other properties owned by the town. We'll list out the options and do test fits on each one of those. The design team will churn through the data and put cost information, schedule impacts, traffic impacts on all those items. Working with the building committee on the left-hand column, we'll establish criteria, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. This chart ends up being a tool that the building committee uses in order to come to resolution on how they compare the relative comparison of each of the options. There is no perfect option out there, but this is about gradation amongst the options to find the best solution for the town of Hopkinton. Graphically, we put that in a traffic light scenario. Yeah. Green means go, right, where the darker green has the most favorability of the options as they relate to each other. You may ultimately get to a decision where one of the options has mostly green but still has a red and ultimately is the best solution for the town, even though a particular category is red. We don't weight these, as weighting themselves could take months and months to debate the nuances of one versus the other. Each of the criteria are important on their own right, an important topic for the committee to discuss and debate as they come to a recommendation to bring back to the town and the voters. The next slide talks about where we are in the process. So this is criteria that's available to the town and used in many other towns. We're going to take this list and then add to it with the feedback from the building committee, faculty, and from you and the public tonight. The reason for that is that these are important not only to build a new school, but we want to make sure what's important to build Hopkinton's new school. Some of the criteria that's up on the screen here that we've started to talk about with the building committee are the educational program. It's very critically important to know that does it fit the program on the site and all the accoutrements that are needed to have the school. Cost above baseline. Again, this is the relative cost amongst the options. It's not a finite hard bid number. We're still early in the conceptual stage of the project. Scheduled duration, disruption to education, sustainability, and net zero. You'll hear about those products tonight in terms of the goals of the project in terms of green construction. Other items to consider are impacts to neighbors, swing space, which would be space needed if you would do an add reno option. Where would the occupants go and how would they be impacted? Traffic impact, both on-site and off-site, parking, permitting complexities. As Dan noted, some of the parcels were ruled out because of their wetlands, setbacks, and other things. We want to make sure that whatever options does get to the final table with the building committee is buildable. Future growth. You've been through a massive amount of growth over the past 10 years. We want to make sure that this option addresses that growth, but also has additional capacity for future expansions if necessary. Impacts on district operation, public safety considerations, site complexities such as wetlands or ledge or access, walkability, bikeability, and then proximity to public utilities. So this image on the screen here is the Mentimeter. So this is the first time we're asking you to consider giving your input about what the priority are amongst these items. So you can take your phone and scan that image there on the screen if you'd like. It'll come up with this list of options that we've just discussed here in the meeting, and you can, I think it's asking the top three. Yeah, asking you for your top three as to what you think is a priority for the building committee to consider. So you can take a moment now to fill that in. Those of you that are at home, the Mentimeter is also available for you to do that. So your data will also be live streamed on the next slide when we get to that, and it'll show the initial feedback of the public, both here and abroad at their homes.
Can we put it on the slide that has the Mentimeter address too?
Yeah.
In case somebody can't scan the QR in there. That one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll give those at home a moment. There's a couple other times tonight that we'll sidestep to collect your feedback and presence here to make sure we're collecting the right feedback. to feed back to the building committee. So your live data is being fed up to the screen in front of you now. As those at home are adding, you may see the numbers fluctuate. Certainly, the initial feedback amongst those you following at home and in the audience, our educational program fitting is, of course, critical, as well as future growth. Certainly two things that are near and dear in this particular town. Other higher items are sustainability, cost, traffic, and district operations are some of the other ones that are in the mid-ranges at this point. So thank you for your feedback. We appreciate that. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather and her team to talk about sustainability with Dan and Heather.
Thank you. We'll tag team this a little bit. So we're going to talk about sustainability and in particular the idea of net zero energy or net zero ready. That's one part of sustainability. And what does it mean? What it means is that the building has energy and cooling and lighting and things that you plug in like computers. Our goal is to make as energy efficient a building as we can, using as little energy as possible. The net zero part of it comes from once we've made a very efficient building, can we, over the course of a year, make as much power as we need so that on a net basis over the course of the year, we make as much energy as we use. So that's the concept of net zero. And here on the screen, you see an equation where on the left, we're representing in something that plugs in, your school that plugs in, and a red meter that says that's the energy you need. A net zero energy building is one that adds to it the part on the right side of the equation, which is the energy that we can produce. So when those equate, you have a net zero energy building. And a net zero ready building is one that focuses on the left side and is ready to provide the power production, solar panels or something else, usually solar panels, that are represented on the right-hand side. So over the course of this evening and the design, we'll be talking about this concept of net zero energy.
Okay, so we're gonna hop back to the Mentimeter again, and this time, let me just go ahead and advance the slide here. We want to ask, when you hear net zero, what do you think? So throw in some words, terms, ideas, concerns maybe you might have. And those will start to populate on the screen here. Net zero bust. There's some great ones that are coming up here. I think I'm seeing a lot of kind of costs, but on both sides of the equation. So, some are saying that there might be cost, it might be expensive up front, but some are talking about kind of low energy costs, fiscal responsibility over time, not a burden on town utilities. So there's some interesting kind of overlap between that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Airtight, high efficiency, net zero bust is my favorite. And yeah, so there's a lot of good things here. Thank you for contributing. I also like the social responsibility one, whoever put that in. We can talk a little bit more about that in a second. But this is good to get a sense of kind of what when you hear the word net zero, what you're thinking. Paperless. Okay, so now we're gonna flip back here. So on that note, when we first started designing net zero energy buildings years ago, there was a client that approached us and said, if I have to choose between net zero energy and education's gonna win out, with the assumption being that, net zero might cost more, and if I'm spending more on the net zero side of things, and that's gonna take away from the education side of things, then I don't want it. But what we found actually is that's not the case, and in fact, pursuing net zero energy can help support creating an even higher quality educational environment. So what we're gonna talk about now is kind of how what we're seeing on some of our past projects and how that overlap works.
So what we want to share with you is a case study. This is Boston Arts Academy building that's just been occupied, but it's representative of an approach that we take that we call integrative design. Basically what it means is that we're thinking about the interconnection of different systems and how they benefit each other. So in this particular case, and it's a common way of thinking about things, we were looking at how the building enclosure, the windows and the walls could be designed, and also the building systems that go into the building. So how do you heat and cool the building? And we were looking at trade-offs of one window that's a standard window and a higher performance window that might cost a bit more, and one building system that might be standard and one that's a bit higher performance. And what we found was, and this is on this project where we were looking at the data, but many others, by improving the windows, we're able to actually use the higher performance building system and downsize that as well, because we weren't going to lose as much heating or as much cooling through the windows. So terrific. What was the impact on that? Obviously, better energy efficiency. So that certainly met one of the goals. But surprising to some is that it also cost essentially the same. Over $500,000 on these systems, the difference was a percent or less. That was during our modeling of these systems. And it turns out that the city went with this option of the higher performance, in part because it also avoided a whole lot of equipment that they wouldn't need with the higher performance because the windows would be so good. But over the course of the project, they went and bid out to the contractors these systems. And over that period, the mechanical systems got more and more expensive because of inflation and the like. At the end, they would have saved, they did actually save, it's not in these numbers, a whole lot of money by going this way. So not only in terms of the operational cost, but also the upfront cost.
And so when we kind of look at this optimization that we're talking about, that's really where we start to see, we're able to meet net zero energy at little to no added cost. And a lot of times what we like to do is zoom into strategies that have impact across all of these categories. And indoor environmental quality strategies,
include 4 particular ones that we're always looking at. They're here: daylight, thermal comfort, acoustics, and air quality. These are things which have an impact and a benefit in terms of energy, but also in terms of your priority in terms of program, student learning. Students are more comfortable. The daylight is better. They don't have to have electric lights on as much. The acoustics are better, and that's something that is really at the fore now with the understanding that people learn differently and have different sensitivities to the acoustical environment. And then I think we're all very attuned to air quality, especially in the last couple of years with the pandemic. So all of these things are working together, and it's borne out in statistics that have been studied in terms of each of these categories. I'll give it another try.
Yeah. Sorry. So back to that original question that we got from the client about if I have to choose between net zero energy and education, I want net zero. This is the school that we ended up building for them. And we came back afterwards and did a lot of post-occupancy evaluation to kind of understand the impact of that school and what we were delivering. And what we found was that because of this high-performance school, that there was significantly higher satisfaction rates among students, and also that people agree that the building itself was supporting the educational outcomes within that facility. And we dug into these 4 indoor environmental quality parameters specifically to see how they were impacting the teachers and the students. And we saw significant improvements in air quality, thermal comfort, acoustics, and daylight, all 4 of those categories within this facility, which led to those increase in satisfaction rates that you saw, but also led to improved outcomes. So we were seeing increased attendance rates, things like that. So this is really, by zooming into strategies that have impact across all these categories that can save energy, but also can impact the quality educational environment, that's how we start to kind of optimize the design to really bring net zero in. And so we coined this term called net positive education, which is using the rigor of a net zero energy process, but making sure that we're zooming into the strategies that have impact across all these categories to also contribute positively to the educational environment, because ultimately that's what we're here to do, right? That's what our goal is. So, so these 2 things are very much aligned from our perspective. So with that, I'd like to take a second to provide a little case study that starts to kind of bring this concept to life in a different way. So this is John Lewis Elementary School. It's a school that recently completed. It is targeting a triple certification. So there's a variety of different sustainability certifications that you pursue. We've mentioned net zero energy already. This school is on track to become net zero energy within the next year. It's also targeting LEED Platinum actually, and it's targeting a newer certification called WELL, which is focused on health and wellness of the built environment and how that impacts the occupants. So it's able to target these 3 certifications because of the reasoning that I just mentioned, because we zoomed into these strategies that have impact across all of these categories. So I just want to go through this and talk a little bit about how we approach sustainability on this project to kind of broaden our perspective around sustainability. So there's 10 measures here. Sorry. That from our perspective represent sustainable, high-performing building. The first is designing for integration. And this is really just making sure that when we're talking about sustainability and thinking about it, we're looking at it holistically. So we're not just talking about energy in a vacuum, we're also talking about water and how the building sits in its context and how it relates to the community and how you know, the energy is being provided, how it might impact the wellness of the space. So bringing all of these aspects of sustainability into one when we're making design decisions. The next measure is around equitable communities, making sure that we're kind of thinking and responding appropriately to our community. How is the community going to be able to access and use the facility during the day, after hours? Can it use the grounds, and how does that happen? But also, how does the building relate in its context to its surrounding? Is it respectful of its context through its design? The next is ecosystems. So for this particular project, it's right by a large park called Rock Creek Park. And so there is a fair amount of site and a need for heavy amounts of bioretention. So actually in the middle of a large bioretention cell, we placed an outdoor classroom. And surrounding this outdoor classroom is vegetation that will be filled out. These were very new pictures. I actually have better ones. But as the students are in this outdoor classroom, they can be a connected part of an ecosystem. They can kind of see the bioretention flooding over time. We just had a hurricane, and they could see it flood and they could see it drain. but they can also experience the native plants, flora and fauna that are part of this Rock Creek Park watershed. And speaking of water, certainly the building itself is reducing water consumption. That's also a priority, so making sure that we're installing low-flow fixtures and making smart decisions from that perspective, but also connecting students with this broader water cycle, and again, allowing them to see kind of the localized kind of flooding and storage of water after major storm events, allowing them to literally walk over it so that they can kind of be a participant in this, but then see it kind of dry over time when we haven't had large periods of rain. Energy, this building, again, is targeting net zero. It takes a year to actually achieve net zero, so we're currently working on that. But a big part of the focus to get to net zero relates back to what we were talking about earlier, is we spent a lot of time focusing on daylight and how we're bringing that into the space so we don't have to use electric lighting, but also knowing that that particular strategy has a lot of benefits in other ways, particularly in terms of well-being, in terms of wellness. So prioritizing how we can daylight spaces, classroom spaces, but also some of the larger spaces within the school, we looked at very early to make sure that we could create what we call a daylight autonomous space, meaning for the majority of the year, you never have to turn on those electric lights, only on very cloudy days. Or if you're using the building or classrooms obviously at night, then you need the electric lights, but normally that building is perfectly lit adequately by the sun. Other things to consider from a well-being perspective are some of the strategies we mentioned earlier: acoustics, thermal comfort, and certainly air quality. And for this particular building or school, we also looked at aspects of a term called biophilia, which is kind of how we naturally relate to our environments. And in this particular image, it shows an opportunity for students to experience what's called prospect and refuge, where you're sitting in a space of refuge, you feel safe, but you can look over your surroundings, particularly for younger students. That's an important aspect to be able to provide within the physical space. Designing for resources. So this one focuses on the materials that are being brought into the building, looking at maybe the energy or the carbon associated with those materials to begin with, and making sure that we're making smart decisions from that perspective and reducing the amount of energy that's needed to construct this facility to begin with, but also thinking about the durability of these materials over time, designing it so that we don't have to replace the drywall every 5 years, but that we can kind of extend life in different ways. And also making sure that the materials that are being brought in don't have chemicals of concern or toxins, which a lot of building materials unfortunately do. So paying close attention to that to remove toxins or chemicals of concern from our indoor environments. Designing for change. This one is really about resilience and planning for the future. So whether that's planning for a future climate and designing a building to make sure that we're adaptable for that future climate, or it's considering the future of learning and how we're starting to change how classes are run and taught, and the spaces therefore need to adapt. So not only within the classrooms themselves, but maybe providing a central space that allows for classroom expansion and flexibility and the use of that space in different ways over time. And then finally, designing for discovery. So this, for this particular school, we actually created a virtual dashboard which allows, we worked hand in hand with the teachers and allows them to use ways to kind of make sure that the kind of building can come to life, and we can use it to kind of promote learning and also create a future generation of environmental stewards, hopefully, through this process. So that's a general overview. Hopefully it kind of broadens your perspective around sustainability and what we're talking about here, but now we want to jump into, particularly for Hopkinton, to talk a little bit more closely around that.
And as you heard, we're really not even at the beginning of design yet in many ways. There's a long process to go through on that. but we want to zoom back in and think about one of the major metrics that we want to meet along the way and how we will do that as we go through the design. And you may have noticed on several slides these three letters together, EUI. Sometimes we throw these letters out there and forget that everybody isn't thinking the same way we are. So let me say what that is. That's energy use intensity. You can think about that as miles per gallon. You know, how efficient is miles per gallon? You know, how efficient is the building? And it's measured in energy per unit area over time. So the numbers that we look at for that, the existing Elmwood school is nearly 70 what? 70 kilobTUs for each square foot for each year. But stick with an EUI of 70 and you'll be okay. With an integrated high efficiency building, we can reduce the need for energy down to less than half of that. So we think 25 to 30 EUI for that. And so that's a significant reduction that comes with less energy, therefore less energy cost, and less maintenance too. So not only that, we're looking at moving from the gray being electric and gas to solar. So if it's a net zero energy building, we're replacing all of those fuels with solar electric. So that's the mindset and the overriding intent of a net zero building. Two things. Remember that equation. On the left was what you needed, and on the right was the power that you would get. Now we're thinking about what can the building do kind of through good design on its own, and then how can we provide some systems for better power options. So that first category, passive design. There are a few things that we're looking at. One is solar orientation. So if you think back to the slide that was about how the building sits on the site, if we can organize the building to address the sun so that we can minimize those early morning and late afternoon times when the sun comes in and it's right in somebody's eyes, and it also creates the need, you know, for more heating systems or cooling systems in that way. We come out ahead because the building is oriented for that. Once we have the building, the next thing is what we call window to wall ratio. It's basically how much window? Is this a glass box or is it a thermos building with no windows? It's somewhere in between, but there are good ratios of that, how much window that we've proven out are good targets. And so as we think about the aesthetic, the architecture, the impression of the building visually, we're also thinking about the performance that goes along with that. Another part of the performance is the daylight optimization that we've both mentioned. Where do we put those windows? Are they high? Are they low? Are they skylights? Lots of options that go with architecture, but also with performance. So that will be part of the process. And then a high performance envelope. We call the skin of the building, the walls and the roof and the floor. That's the envelope, the thing that separates you from the outside. And how can we make that so that you can feel comfortable when you're learning, when you're teaching, without the systems that come along afterwards to make up for that. So then we need active systems too. We will be looking at an all-electric option, and going with that would be geothermal systems, sometimes called ground source systems. That's a way of exchanging energy with the ground. So if you have too much heat and you're trying to cool, you can put that in the ground. Then you can take it back out like from a bank account and use it when you need that. And then finally, PV or photovoltaic panels or solar panels. These are those panels that can go on the roof, or you've seen them over parking, that produce energy. And in a net zero energy building, you'd be trying to get enough of those to satisfy your needs on an annual basis. So that's sort of a quick romp through sort of how we think about the design, not only from an academic point of view, but from a systems point of view.
Yeah, so what we'd like to end with, hopefully through this, it's kind of opened your perspective a little bit to what sustainability is and what are some of the conversations that we might be having as we move forward through the design of this project. And hopefully now the kind of correlation between net zero energy and net positive education and the opportunities that are there kind of shine through for you. What we'd like to do is take one more opportunity to poll the audience. And the last question that we have for you tonight.
I think we should continue on.
Okay. So the last question that we have for you tonight is, so if we think about net zero or sustainability holistically, as we've just kind of gone through, what do you see as the top priorities, or actually opportunities, might be a better word, for this school? And the 10 different measures that I went through are there. You can select 3 of them, and we'll kind of see where we fall.
And as you're doing that, just we'll add that just because you're selecting 3 priorities doesn't mean that we can't, do some of all of these.
We will be thinking about all of them. Oh, this is great to see. Energy's making a run for it. It's coming up on top here. Energy and well-being. I'm glad to see those 2 at the top. And a lot of times it's been, in recent years, it's been a careful focus of our conversation, and certainly of what you saw today. It's a careful focus of our approach. So that's great to see. Integration, thinking about all these things holistically. I like the discovery one popping up there as well. Kind of looking at opportunities to kind of build this as a teaching tool moving forward. Great. Well, thank you all for the feedback. We'll be storing this and using it as we move forward.
So we just wanted to end with letting you all know that we do have a elmwoodproject.com. It's a project website that's available where we're going to be posting updates where you can learn more about the project. As we have these community forums, we'll be building out additional information over the course of the job so that as we approach the decision on the site that we're going to move forward with and how we're going to select a site and select an ultimate design that the town will be voting on, we'll be populating this with the additional work that we've put into the project so that the town has one resource that they can go to understand where the project's at and what's being proposed by the Elementary School Building Committee.
So with that, we wanted to try to divide this hour and a half in 2, 45 minutes or so of a presentation, but this forum is supposed to be a 2-way conversation, and so we want to open this up for a Q&A session now. We covered basically 4 topics over the course of this. We talked about the project and timeline. We talked about the existing facility and the assessment that's been done so far, some work that's been done around potential alternative sites, and obviously the sustainability and net zero energy. You don't need to restrict your questions to those 4 topics, really whatever might be of interest to you with this project. For those who are watching on the HCAM feed, I believe that the email address that you can send your questions to is listed on the screen, but it is ESBC, the number 2, @hopkintonma.gov. so please feel free to send those in. If you're in the building tonight and you want to ask a question, we have 2 microphones at the front. Please come up to the mic and provide us with a question. If you would just, when you do come up to the mic, just introduce yourself like it's town meeting. So name and where you live would be great.
We do have an online question.
Do you want to start with the, let's start with the, yeah.
We'll start with the online question. It's from Chris Kennedy. And the question is, has or will a carbon impact study be performed to compare the embodied carbon of a renovation versus new construction?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually some other, I'm seeing the question here, so there's some other ones, good questions that are embedded within this as well. But right now, we're going through the site evaluation phase, and once we kind of resolve and identify kind of where a few sites will be located and come up with a few different building massing schemes for different locations, we will do a more extensive study that allows us to look at what is the carbon payoff of either keeping the existing building and how high performing can we make that, and versus if we build a new building, the embodied carbon penalty that we have to pay up front and the eventual increase in efficiency over time. So that's an option for us as we move forward, but we're a little early on in the process.
And just some the definition maybe of embodied carbon before we use too much lingo. So we were talking about energy use over the life of the building. Energy and carbon are often related in terms of how much, more energy means more carbon in the environment emitted. Embodied carbon is that carbon that is emitted because you're making a building, right? So the existing building is already made. It took some energy and therefore carbon to make the concrete blocks that are there. The concrete, the ceilings, the lights, everything about it, everything that you're looking at, it took some carbon. So that's embodied carbon. You can think of it as some resource already. It will take more resource to make a new building. And so we'll compare that together with the operational carbon that comes with the heating and the cooling and the lighting that we were talking about before.
And that also ties into a larger process question, which is part of the MSBA process, is that we look at the existing building, we look at an ad reno of the existing building, and we look at new sites. So as part of that broader study that we'll do as we approach that middle phase where we really select a site and move forward with schematic design, we'll do those evaluations.
Does that address the secondary question,
Yeah,
if you
no.
can see it?
So the second
Has the design team evaluated passive house certification?
Right, yeah, so passive house certification, I mentioned there's a lot of different types of sustainability certifications that are out there. Passive house certification is a great certification that really tries to drive at exactly what we talked about today, minimizing energy consumption as much as possible as the main goal in order to make net zero a more feasible opportunity. And for this project, for MSBA purposes, we will be pursuing LEED certification. That's the kind of requirement that we have to meet the MSBA requirements. So we will be moving forward with LEED as the primary certification. That being said, the strategies that Dan outlined today follow very similar with the strategies needed to go to passive house certification. So we use passive house strategies to meet our high performance goals without necessarily pursuing the full certification.
Thank you.
We have a question in the audience.
Yes. My name is Richard DeSimone, 22 Apple Tree Hill. I'd like to offer a plan for consideration is to build a new school on the existing site on the land in between the existing school and Wood Street, and and construct it from Wood Street, and after that raise the existing structure. This has benefits in the sense that there are existing utilities on site. You wouldn't have to repurpose the existing building or facility if you use an alternate site. and I think there'll be a significant cost savings as opposed to a new site. Any questions?
So, thank you. What I would say is that the current Elmwood site, including the parcel out to Wood Street, is part of the consideration of site assessment. So, so definitely appreciate the advantages that would provide. That is a site that we're going to be looking at as part of this. So potentially putting a new building on that portion would be one of those options.
A significant advantage would be that you could build the existing site, construction, without affecting the existing school.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is a major factor, because obviously if you're going to build on where the existing Elmwood site is,
then
we have
you
to
could
figure out
do
what
a
to do with the children.
combination-
So you can do
You could do a
potentially both.
combination after you build a new school of raise or renovate or open up. It's, you know, there's many options there.
Yep, absolutely. And as we get through the site assessment process, we'll provide certainly more information on that potential option as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other?
Jonathan Dashna, 6 Pendulum Pass. Is operation cost going to be a factor in site selection in terms of operations of the building, long-term, short-term? That if a facility like this one is combined, and if this building was put on this facility or on this land, operations would have some savings and shared cost?
Yes.
Yeah, so impact operations is one of the criteria that we covered earlier on, and would be an item to be studied by the committee in terms of the efficiencies of the options that are put out there.
And that is, from a community perspective, I would add that that's something that we'll share openly, that when we go to town meeting, it's not just going to be about what is the price tag to build the building, but then what are the potential impacts on operation. And one of the things we saw when we moved from Center to the new Marathon School was there were actually some operational cost savings just because of the new and more modern building. So that is information that will be well shared in advance at town meeting.
Hi, Sarah Sachi of Greystone Lane. I'm curious if choosing the site will affect the net zero availability of the new building.
Yeah, so as we go through site selection, as a part of kind of the matrix, we'll be looking at net zero and sustainability aspects included within that selection criteria. So we will be assessing all of the sites for net zero feasibility, whether that's can we appropriately orient the building on this site, or do we have enough space to put photovoltaics on this site in general, or is it too shaded from trees, or whatever it might be? Are there opportunities for geothermal potentially, like building a well field? Do we have enough space for that on site? All of these things will be a part of that assessment study. And then will be kind of layered into the criteria on that spreadsheet that was shown earlier.
Okay, great. And then a second question, how sustainable is Marathon? It's something I've never thought of, but now that we're talking about the new school, what does our latest new school look like?
You should answer. You know the EUIs, yes.
So if you went back to the slide where he was talking about the EUI,
Yep.
the EUI currently for Marathon is running around 39. The goal for Marathon was targeted really at 30, but the last 2 years with COVID and running our ventilation at 100%, 24/7, 365 has really brought up our energy use. So right now I would say the numbers are skewed, but you can see the 39 compared to 69 that we're running for Elmwood. So Marathon is definitely much more efficient.
Thank you. Thank you.
John Janino, 13 Valentine Road. I was just wondering, with the schedule I see out here, is the timeline to try and get this on May's town meeting? Is that kind of the goal, or is that not? We don't know that yet.
So the goal is not to get this on May's town meeting. Just
Okay.
from a process perspective, we'd have to rush too many things, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure, the likelihood is this will be a special town meeting.
Okay.
And the tentative target right now is sometime in the late fall of '23.
And what are you targeting to open the school?
So the opening of the school on the timeline would
So
be, help me out.
potentially the opening could be winter of '27, meaning a half year, or the fall of the '27, depending on the ultimate solution. So by fall of '27, the school would be opened, potential to go one semester earlier, depending on options selected and several other criteria.
And lastly, when do we find out how much the state would give us?
What's
So,
the,
one more time?
when do we find out the state reimbursement amount?
So we know the state's reimbursement percentage now, but the ultimate dollars will ultimately be decided when you finalize the size of the project and submit the overall number to the state. The MSBA program is not straight math, and I'll certainly cover that in depth at a future forum, because that question comes up all the time. Based on your percentage rate, they have lots of caps. They cap out construction costs, they cap out consultant fees, and so it's not the straight linear math of the, is it 42%? I think you guys, I can validate the actual number, but we're 42%, but the effective rate ends up being a lot less than that once you factor in all the caps. They also increase those over time. They don't keep up with market rate and inflation, and certainly not in the last 2 years market rate inflation. So their cost per square foot building is a lot less than the current cost, and then multiplied by that factor, which is why the effective rate is less than the straight math rate. But we will cover all that. Yeah.
David Simpson, 16 Ledgestone. You've mentioned a few times looking at either 2 and 3 or 2, 3, and 4 for sizing the school. Now, when you looked at changing the existing, you said that we would need about 60,000 square feet to appropriately fit, the classrooms and all the accommodations. How does that square footage change based off of 2 and 3 versus 2, 3, and 4? And does that impact possible site selection?
Definitely impacts site selection because the building would be larger, so it would, and the program, the site program is also larger. Parking and the playground areas, all those increase with the building size. I believe the building needs to be another 30,000 square feet above that for the 2, 3, 4 option.
So what would drive us to push towards 2, 3, and 4, or 2 and 3? Just growth in this town, or?
So that's a great question that I'll probably mostly kick over to the superintendent, but just to say that the part of the assessment is obviously we want to have a solution that not only solves for Elmwood, but also solves for the larger district space challenges that we have. So what we're doing is we're really syncing up the process of this school building site assessment with work that the district is doing on the grade configuration impacts of changes to the building. Ultimately, it will be up to the district and the school committee to say what is the grade configuration we want to build for, and the building committee will then move forward with that. But obviously, some pieces in terms of the site selection will inform that. But I'll let Dr. Kavanaugh talk more about that process.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that for you. As Mr. Graziano just said, we are really trying to solve for an enrollment problem kind of globally. And so if you do build a 2, 3, 4 school, one of the benefits, I think, is that you have the MSBA reimbursement for an additional grade level. So instead of just building a 2, 3 school where you're going to get funding, you'd be building a 2, 3, 4 school where you're getting funding. However, in sort of that process of solving for enrollment, we have to think about then what happens to Hopkins. It's no secret that right now Hopkins is not large enough to accommodate the number of students attending the Hopkins school. And so really what you would need to do is have 2 projects concurrently. You'd have to have, if you were to build a 2, 3, 4 school and accept that reimbursement and try to use that as, sort of a valve to alleviate some of the pressure, you'd also have to be adjusting Hopkins, maybe with the mindset that grade 6 would move in with grade 5. The beauty of grade 6 moving in with grade 5 is it really takes a whole grade out of that middle school, and it frees up an incredible amount of space there. And if you started to run programs or got your middle school and your high school on the same schedule, you could do some kind of programming where middle school kids could attend high school coursework, and kids at the high school who needed, perhaps some remediation could also be serviced with middle school kids. So there's a programmatic beauty in that at the secondary level as well. And I don't know if I've missed anything, but Mrs. Rothermick and I have had so many conversations about this that I would invite her to contribute to anything I might have overlooked.
Yeah, I think the real big pressure is making sure not only are we doing Elmwood correctly, but we're doing the K-12 for the entire community and really looking at where the buildings are for all of the students. If you look at our enrollment projections from 2009 to what we're looking out to 2029, 2030, we will have added 1,200 students to the district. And as you can imagine, you can't just absorb them in small spaces. So we're really looking to do not only the Elmwood project, but create a long-term plan and vision that the community can really wrap their arms around and know that their students and their children will be taken care of in the best educational facility moving forward.
Thank you.
And if I could just add, so from a process perspective, right, because we're talking about several really big community questions that if we try to answer them without considering they're intertwining are going to crash into each other. And so what we have been doing is the building committee and the school committee and the school district and the select board have been working very close together to put this process, to tie up these processes. Town meeting approved not only a feasibility study for the replacement or renovation of the Elmwood School, but separately there was a feasibility or a campus study to view the enrollment impacts and facilities at all of the school buildings. In conjunction with the school committee, what we've been able to do is actually gain some efficiencies in that, and Perkins Eastman, who will be running the feasibility study for the Elmwood project, will also be running that campus study because it just naturally made sense. They're going to be sharing a lot of the same information and have some information that can help drive the answers to those questions. Dr. Kavanaugh and Mrs. Rothermick and the rest of the district staff will be talking to the school committee a lot about the potential impacts that she just briefly outlined of a change to the grade configuration. The expectation right now is that there will be some forums on the subject in January of the next year. The nice timing of that is that we are due to get our final site selection for the Elmwood project to the MSBA at the end of February. So with those forums, the school committee can collect public opinion and input. They can make a decision about the grade configuration, which will then ultimately drive the solution that the building committee would move forward with. So be on the lookout for a lot of forums. We really want community input on these are big topics, and these committees of 5, 7, 9 people are not the only ones in the community who are impacted. So we want as much input as possible.
And if no one else is waiting, I'll do one quick question. So in the past year, we've had a lot of issues with PFAS in the town. For this school, would we be looking to hook up to town water, or would we be looking to do well, or is that really dependent on site selection? And if we do wells, how would we deal with potential PFAS and things like that in the future?
Great question. I don't know if that's I don't know about the water
Might be
supply.
out of scope.
Yeah. No, it's definitely not out of scope. I'm not sure of the answer to that from a
So
process
I will say
perspective.
that, site selection, public utilities is one of the criteria that we would be looking at. If you were to do a well, and probably Perkins Eastman can speak to this better, if you were to do your own well, then you would have to go to the DEP and get your own permit, if you will, and you'd have to follow all those permit requirements according to the DEP, according to your permit for that well. So you would still have to address all of those issues, but you would be addressing it on your own as opposed to the Hopkinton Water Department. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Finally, the other microphone's getting some work.
Hi, Brianna Mangano, I'm at 10 Hill Street. I just want to know where in this process we get feedback from the students and teachers. What works in their current classrooms, what doesn't, what's not working at Elmwood for them, what do they want to see?
Usually the feedback from the teachers starts during and after the visioning, which is one of the processes that was mentioned earlier. So when that's happening concurrently, we'll start to go in and do what we call like a first preliminary round of interviews, which starts to give us an idea of, and help us refine the program even more.
Do we
So
get
the
feedback from the
next-
students too?
We
We'd
also,
love to include the students, absolutely.
Yes.
yes, we do have an educational team that meets on Fridays, and I know that Mrs. Carver has a plan with Perkins Eastman for soliciting information from the kids at Elmwood.
We've also reached out and done an initial survey amongst all the teachers in the district online. Those results came in, and we presented that earlier today to the Elmwood teachers. So there is an ongoing feedback loop.
Yeah, there's a forum that occurs, every time we have one of these forums, we have a forum in the afternoon for the faculty. So we want to give them their own opportunity simply because we don't want them to have to stay in town longer. But so yes, the engagement of the faculty is critical. Faculty and staff is critical, so we are collecting that ongoing. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Linda Chus from 11 School Street. Great presentation on the sustainability aspects. Thank you. There were a couple areas I didn't hear addressed, and one of them is transportation and the sustainability impacts. There's a lot of idling at schools as people drive their cars to wait. And I did hear a talk about middle school and high school schedule syncing. I just don't know if there's been any consideration given to the emissions aspects of the school and the new building and what can possibly be done about that.
That's a great question. A lot of it, I mean, we are undergoing some traffic assessments once we kind of understand a little bit more about what sites we're going to be looking into, we'll go through some traffic assessments. And then as a part of that, we'll look at, what that means in terms of on-site or local traffic in terms of idling and things like that. That specifically is not a part of the LEED kind of criteria, so it's interesting you bring it up. There are some other rating systems that do address on-site idling in different ways. We do have kind of opportunities for reducing that with how we kind of design the flow patterns to allow for that to be kind of reduced. So that's a great consideration and something we can look into more as we move forward with site selection.
And the people of Hopkinton know very well that traffic, particularly on Hayden Row, is a concern for everyone. And so as we're looking at those various site assessment, the traffic light scenario that we outlined, we may see a situation where, for instance, operational costs by putting the school closer may be cheaper, but it may increase traffic or vice versa. So that's why we try to evaluate those items from a sort of a good, better, best perspective, because it may not be that one site hits all the marks, and that's a perfect example.
Another question relates to waste management. I don't know if it's a big deal or not, but I don't know if there's been any thought given to that in the new school design.
Yeah, so the LEED criteria does address waste, and it addresses it in a few different ways. So one is during construction and demolition. So there's construction and demolition waste management. The contractor for the project will need to deliver a plan at the beginning that kind of outlines exactly what they're going to be doing, and we usually set specific targets for the amount of waste that needs to be diverted from a landfill. So that's something that will be, once a contractor gets engaged, we'll be having those conversations and kind of working towards that, but that is a part of the system. Additionally, in terms of the waste within the building that's generated on a daily basis, the LEED requirement does outline that you need to kind of come up with a waste diversion plan that can be implementable in terms of recycling. So that's something that we will be working together with the school to deliver. And then, there's certainly other opportunities to discuss. We're so early on that we haven't had these conversations yet, but things like, composting or, how is food being served in the cafeteria, and are there ways to kind of reduce waste as associated with that? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for waste conversations, but we're just kind of early on in that process.
Some of that comes out in the interviews that Dan was talking about, where that will be with teachers and, students and staff, but the staff including custodial and, the food side of things. So those are two places that would impact the question that you have. So how do we integrate with the system that's in place, or how do we help to re-envision what that might be going forward and accommodate within the, not only the building, but also the site in terms of holding waste and the like.
I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One of the things I'd wanted to note when we said we're following LEED, the MSBA offers the town 2 incentive points for reimbursement, so a higher level of reimbursement if you pick either LEED or New England CHIPS. And so those are the 2 vehicles that are available to us, and we've selected LEED for this project.
Hi, Jeff Rowland, 14 Old Farm Road. You'd used the phrase net zero on an annual basis a couple times for buildings that are little used for a few months of the year. I wonder, does that mean the system is undersized for a daily basis?
So what it means is that if you think about, and I don't really want to do this right now on this beautiful evening, but if you think about February and you think about the fact that we've got a lot of heating to do, and that'll take some energy, but it tends to be a cloudy time, right? And snow tends to pile up on solar panels. It's very hard to meet your needs in that month. Whereas during the summer, lots of sun, lots of clear skies, lots of power production. And so when we talk about on an annual basis, it means there are going to be times when you're making more energy than you need and times when it's too difficult on a given site to do that. So that we always look at it over time, and we use a year for that. Gets you through that cycle.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
There are no additional questions online.
Okay. Well, if there are no additional questions, then I would highlight what's up on the screen, which is that we're continuing with the community engagement process as we go through the project process. Our next community forum will be on November 2nd. I would say location to be determined, but I'm also pretty sure it's going to be here because this seems to work really well, especially from the HCAM broadcast perspective. And you can also look for the agenda of topics to come out, usually about 10 days or so prior to that particular forum. The best way to continue to stay up to date on this process is our website is up there, elmwoodproject.com. That's where we post all the information about our meetings, about any news and information. As we collect questions from the community, we'll be putting together a frequently asked questions that can be up there as a resource as well. So that is the best place to interact with us. If you are watching this not live on HCAM, or you are watching it live or here and think of a question later, please email us. Again, the email address you can get through the website, but it is esbc2@hopkintonma.gov. And appreciate everyone's time tonight. I know it's always a busy time, especially in the fall. So we really do appreciate everyone coming out and those who could watch us on HCAM. Thank you and have a good night.